Now, with physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, just like with abortion, there are a range of different positions one can take, both with respect to the legality and with respect to the morality of physician-assisted suicide. And on the far extreme, there is what you might call just outright opposition to both physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. And there are a host of reasons that people might have for opposing both of these, physician assisted suicide and euthanasia, both morally and legally. Then, what is the moderate voice of the right to die movement? I'm calling it moderate. I guess it would be extreme to some people, but of the right to die movement, this would be the more moderate voice. They believe that physician assisted suicide is morally and legally or morally it's permissible, and it should be legally permissible also, but only for those who are terminally ill and those who are in unremitting pain. And the moderate position, and this is really the position of Timothy Quill, the doctor I was mentioning in the last video lecture, they also believe that euthanasia should be illegal. Now, what's really important here is there are real big questions as to whether or not the moderate position can be maintained. All of those who defend, well, let me rephrase that. The majority of those who defend physician-assisted suicide as something that should be legal nowadays, the majority of them, they agree that euthanasia should be off the table, that euthanasia should be illegal. But there's a huge question here as to whether or not you can maintain a clear dividing line between physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. That is to say, once you go the route of legalizing physician-assisted suicide, is there an in-principle line that you can draw so that you can say yay for physician-assisted suicide but nay for euthanasia? There are also big questions that some people raise as to whether or not you can maintain physician-assisted suicide or keep it legal only for those who are terminally ill and for those who are in unremitting pain. We'll address those questions later down the road. Right now, what I'm trying to impress upon you is that the moderate voice of the right to die movement, what they want to maintain is physician-assisted suicide is morally and should be legally permissible only for those who are terminally ill and who are in unremitting pain. Euthanasia should be and always should remain completely illegal. Then there are going to be between this moderate position and more extreme positions a host of different views, but one that I'm just kind of highlighting here, I'm calling the more liberal position. They believe that physician-assisted suicide should be available to any competent adult who is in pain according to their definition of pain. Now notice here, you don't have to be terminally ill. And your pain doesn't necessarily, for the more liberal position, it doesn't have to necessarily be physical pain. Maybe some people would regard any kind of loss of dignity. For instance, people who are suffering from dementia. For some people who suffer from this or Alzheimer's, there's a certain loss of dignity, and that's sufficient to qualify as pain. For people within this more liberal point of view, they think even depression should qualify as a kind of pain. Within this group, you see ambivalence, however, when it comes to the topic of euthanasia. They clearly support physician-assisted suicide, and what makes them different, really, from the more moderate voice in their support of physician-assisted suicide is they want to cast a much broader net. They want to allow for many, many more people to be able to obtain physician-assisted suicide through legal measures. They're a little bit more ambivalent about euthanasia. And so here you can see where some fissures in the dam start to crack a little bit. Like I said, the reason they're going to be, as we'll see later on, pushed more towards these liberal positions is the underlying philosophical justification that they offer for why it should be legal in the first place. Then finally we come to the most extreme kind of position and the right to die movement. And people here that adopt this most extreme position, they say that physician-assisted suicide should be available to any competent adult. If you're 18 and you're deemed competent, then you should be allowed to kill yourself, and you should be allowed to go to a doctor, have that doctor prescribe you drugs. You don't have to be sick. You don't have to be in pain. If you want to do it, you should be allowed to do it. And for the people within this extreme group, they also support euthanasia. They say, yeah, euthanasia should be legal. And the reason, we'll see this later on, they'll say all the same reasons that justify physician-assisted suicide, or the good reasons that justify it, would lead us to also justify and support euthanasia. Now, as it currently stands in the United States, the vast majority of people, and I've said this before, are against euthanasia. You see this in every Gallup poll, that the vast majority of people are against euthanasia. And so even this liberal position, this one is going to be much more extreme. And the radical, or the extreme position I'm describing down here, this one's certainly on the fringe. What you see, the two main positions that people adopt now is either this moderate position or what I'm just calling opposition. This more conservative position up here. A couple of lectures, we're going to come back to talking about the legality of physician-assisted suicide. But first we're going to turn to some more philosophical issues that pertain to physician-assisted suicide. And in particular, we're going to talk about the morality of physician-assisted suicide, and as well as the rationality of it. And the truth is that both of these issues, the morality of physician-assisted suicide and rationality of it, is driven by our underlying feelings, or I should say our underlying beliefs about the moral permissibility of suicide in general, or our beliefs about the rationality of suicide, or the morality of suicide. And I think that I would have to say, growing up, what I was taught as a child is that suicide is something that is always wrong. Suicide is something that is immoral. You do not commit suicide. But the truth is this is not a feeling that is shared by people around the world. And throughout history, we've seen people take very, very different attitudes towards the morality of suicide. And here is a famous Roman orator. His name was Seneca. And he said this about suicide. He said, "Against all the injuries of life, I have always the refuge of death." In other words, no matter how bad things get, I always have the right to kill myself, which that certainly goes against what I was taught growing up. That's certainly not in line with what I was taught. And so we see here the beginnings of a controversy, because as it turns out, some people don't view suicide itself as immoral. Some people actually regard suicide as honorable. The Japanese, for instance, they regarded suicide, the act of killing yourself, for, maybe you shamed your family or you brought dishonor, then the noble thing to do would be to kill yourself. Our society, we have very different attitudes about suicide. And you can see here that if people have different attitudes, if some people think suicide is immoral, well then assisted suicide is clearly going to be immoral also. I mean, if it's wrong for you to kill yourself, then certainly it would be wrong for me to help you kill yourself. On the other hand, if you think there's nothing wrong with suicide, if suicide is something that is morally permissible, well then me helping you do it is not going to be wrong either. So you can see here that the controversy that really surrounds physician-assisted suicide turns on our feelings and our attitudes about suicide itself. If suicide is wrong, then assisting in a suicide is wrong. If suicide is permissible, then assisting in a suicide is also permissible. Here's something that's more in line with what I was taught growing up. G.K. Chesterton, he's a famous British social commentator and theologian, and he said, "Not only is suicide a sin, it is the sin. It is the ultimate and absolute evil. The man who kills a man kills a man. The man who kills himself kills all men. As far as he is concerned, he wipes out the world." And Chesterton, he's, using a lot of flowery language here. He's really overstating things, but I think he does capture something that is consistent with the attitude that a lot of us who've grown up in the West take towards suicide. It's just wrong. You don't do it. You can understand someone, maybe killing another person in self-defense, but you just can't understand, I think, almost in all cases, why someone would kill themselves. I think even sometimes when you find out about someone who was near the end of their life and they kill themselves, it's something there's something tragic about that, and I think it's something disturbing for a lot of people. So we have different views about the moral permissibility of suicide. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to first focus on this question about whether or not suicide is morally permissible, yes or no. There's a second question, though, that we're going to return to, and that question is, independently of whether or not suicide is morally right or wrong, there's a good question about whether or not it's rational to ever perform suicide or commit suicide. And this is a really separate question because, as it turns out, there are a lot of things that are perfectly morally okay, but they're irrational. And in fact, in some cases, actions are so irrational, we have an obligation to stop someone from doing it. And so this could constitute an independent line of reasoning as to why we might not want to assist someone in ending their life, because it might be the kind of action that is nothing morally wrong about it per se, but it's irrational. And because it's irrational, we should not help someone do it. In fact, we should stop them from doing it. So we'll return to that later on, but right now what we're going to do is focus on whether or not suicide is something that is morally permissible or not. And there are a host of different kinds of arguments that people make that to the effect that suicide is immoral. But there are two types of arguments that I want to bring up right now, and then we're going to look at some possible problems with these arguments, and you can determine for yourself if you find these kinds of arguments persuasive or not. But one of the main kinds of arguments against suicide itself, and again, we're focusing only on suicide. We're not talking about assisting suicide right now. We're talking about just, is it morally permissible to kill yourself? Do you do anything wrong, morally speaking, if you were to kill yourself? And one of the main arguments hinges on this notion that there's just something sacred about life itself. And to kill any life, even your own life, violates a certain kind of moral obligation that you have to yourself. To kill any life, even your own life, disregards the utter sanctity that all human lives have. And if you want to press this line of thought about the sanctity of life, there are different kind of underlying reasons that people offer to think that life is sacred in just this way. But one of them really, I think honestly, the main driving force for this kind of position or this argument here about the sanctity of life hinges on certain religious commitments that people bring to the table. And a lot of people are motivated by this. I see it a lot that comes up in Christianity. People will argue that your life is not your own life. Your life belongs to the Lord. And so, therefore, it would be wrong for you to take your own life because it's not yours to take. I say Christianity, actually, a lot of I think probably in Judaism as well as Islam, they might have similar kind of theological commitments in place. Not all religions would have this in place. There's certainly certain Eastern religions that wouldn't have this in place. But if you bring to the table this theological commitment that your life is not yours, your life belongs to the Lord, it's not your life to take, then you can see on that ground why suicide would be immoral. Some people also say something along these lines, that suicide, that if you kill yourself, you can't ask for forgiveness of that sin, and so therefore it's punishable. That's another way you might, kind of motivate this notion of the sanctity of life. Not everybody is going to be swayed by these kinds of religious arguments, though a lot of people do find them persuasive. There are other ways you could justify this that don't necessarily justify this notion of sanctity of life, that don't necessarily turn on any kind of religious commitments that you have in place, but they do derive from a more philosophical foundation. And in fact, we saw this in Kant. Kant says you should never treat anyone as a mere means to an end. And if you were to kill yourself, Kant says that in doing that, you're treating yourself as a mere means to an end. He says that if you kill yourself, then you're doing it, maybe to alleviate pain. But then you're just using yourself to alleviate pain, which is you have an end in mind, the alleviation of pain, and you're just disposing of yourself as a way of doing that. And so Kant says that is wrong, to treat yourself in just that way. Some of you may not be satisfied with the Kantian answer, and so maybe a more straightforward way of justifying this notion of kind of harm to yourself or the sanctity of life hinges not on any kind of Kantian or religious answer, but just a kind of more basic notion that you have certain duties of self-love to yourself, that you have certain duties to take care of yourself. And we recognize that there's something wrong if somebody in a way desires to do something that's not in their own interest. And I mean that in like, if someone desires to, for instance, harm themselves. Or think about, like, even if somebody is just downing themselves. You've probably been around someone who will just say things like, I'm ugly, nobody will ever love me, I'm worthless. And there seems something wrong about that. And I think most of the time when we confront that, we'll say, no, that's not true. You have so much to offer. We'll say things like that, even though deep down we're thinking, yeah, you're kind of right. But in all seriousness, it just seems something defective if a person doesn't have that kind of proper attitude of self-love. As Whitney Houston said, learning to love yourself is the greatest gift of all, after all. So, I went there. So, in any event, this is a kind of argument that people make against suicide. They say there's just something, you have this kind of duties to yourself. You harm yourself. And there's something immoral about harming yourself. It takes away from the overall sanctity of life in some way or another. There's another kind of argument that people make against suicide to the effect that suicide is immoral. And they say that it's not so much about doing anything immoral to harm yourself, but when you commit suicide, you actually harm others. Whenever you commit suicide, that affects the community around you. And I think, about, famous people who've killed themselves, even though a lot of times we don't know these people, apart from the handful of movies we've seen, it can be really hurtful and traumatizing to us when we learn that somebody famous has died. We'll have stories run about them all over the globe. Robin Williams killed himself just a couple years ago, and that was something that it was hard for a lot of people who never even met him. But on a more personal level, like if it's someone who's a family member who ends their own life, that can be traumatizing for years to come. One of my mother's best friends, her son was 18 years old. He was a few weeks from graduating high school. He went in the woods and shot himself. There was no sign of depression. There was no sign his life was bad. Nothing. And he did that. And that was about 20 years ago. And to this day, every time my mom sees her friend, they see each other, once a month or so, she mentions her son who killed himself. I mean, that's left a scar that's never going to heal. And that's the truth about suicide. People regard it a lot of times as just this personal decision you make, but that's just not true. It's not totally a personal decision. You affect tons of people. People you think you would never affect, they're going to be affected. And so here are, I think, two of the kind of main types of arguments against suicide. The first one I have labeled sanctity of life, but really, truly, we could reduce the first argument to just the idea that there's something wrong in harming yourself in some kind of way. Apart from any effects that you have on others, there's something wrong about harming yourself. The second kind of argument, it's based around this idea that apart from any harm you do to yourself, there's a harm you do to others, and that's what makes suicide immoral. And the truth is these two arguments, in theory, they could work together. I mean, it could be, you're performing a moral violation in two ways. You're violating a kind of duty that you have to yourself, and so you're doing something immoral on that front, and also you're harming others, and so also you're doing something immoral on that front as well. So don't think of it as like an either or here. Think of it as it could be one or the other, or it could be both. So here are the two kinds of arguments against suicide and to the effect that suicide is immoral. Now, a number of people hear this and they have serious questions about both of these. And look, I'm not here to tell you what to believe or anything like that, but I'm just going to state, possible responses that people make with regard to these two arguments. And the first response to this idea of duties that you have to yourself, I would just say this, is that even though you have certain duties to yourself, there's a serious question here as to whether or not this kind of idea that life is sacred implies that there can be no exceptions to particular cases where someone wouldn't be justified in killing themselves. So just think of it like this. In general, we say life is sacred, but we all recognize that there are certain instances where it's justifiable to take somebody else's life, right? If somebody is attacking you, for instance, in those cases, it is justifiable, even though their life is sacred, to kill them in order to save your own life. And so the response to the first argument we've been looking at is just, it begins in this way: to say, okay, I agree that life is sacred, but does the fact that life is sacred require that there can be no exceptions whatsoever that might justify killing myself? And what people who defend this idea that you have a right to die would say is, yes, there can be exceptions. And in particular, there can be exceptions when your life has just become so much of a burden to you. So you might think about this for a second. Suppose that you're just suffering and agony. People, for instance, who develop bone cancer. People who develop bone cancer, they can't be treated for their pain once it gets to a certain level, and they just scream in agony all their life for the short bit of life they have. And you might say, but look, but you can't kill yourself because it would, you have, your life is sacred, and to kill yourself would violate this kind of duty of self-love that you have, or to kill yourself would treat yourself as a mere means to an end. That just seems kind of weird in a way, because it's saying in order to show love to yourself, you have to undergo excruciating pain for the last few days of your life. That's a weird way of showing love to yourself. It's like, I show love to myself, or I show how sacred my life is by just suffering in absolute agony, and agony beyond anything probably any of us could comprehend. That's how you show love to yourself. And we can make a comparison here between removing life support, because in general, people don't have any kind of qualms about removing life support from a person, even the person refusing life support if it would keep them alive. We don't say, well, you're not showing proper respect. You're violating your duties of self-love by removing your life support. Because we recognize when a person gets to a certain stage, it's perfectly morally permissible to do that, and it in no way violates the kind of duty they have to themselves. It in no way demonstrates a lack of respect for the sanctity of life. They're allowed to remove that in order to not have to endure any longer. And so we could make a comparison here. It's like, but if they're allowed to remove life support and die, why shouldn't a person who's suffering in this kind of way be allowed to end their life already? Why shouldn't they be allowed to end their life? So this is the way that people, I think, typically respond to this kind of idea that in killing yourself, you're doing something immoral because you're violating this kind of duty you have to yourself. You're demonstrating that life is somehow not sacred. Now, the argument that I think really has more punch to it is this idea of harms to others, because I can't deny that that's true. I mean, I've seen it with my own eyes that if a person kills themselves, they cause, severe harm to others around them. And that's certainly true. And I think anybody who ever contemplates suicide, that's something you should keep in mind. Is like, think of the damage it would do to the people you love most if you were to kill yourself. I know it's hard in those moments when you're depressed to think in that way, but you are loved. You really are. And if you were to take your own life, you would just do so much damage to those people around you. They would blame themselves for the rest of their days. And that's undeniable. And so I can see here, this is why people, a lot of times, they regard suicide as the ultimate selfish action. because you care about yourself over the good of everybody else around you. You care about yourself and are putting yourself over the harm. You're basically saying, this is why Chesterton said you wipe out the entire world, is you're basically saying to everybody, I'd rather be dead than to be around you, and I don't care how my death affects any of you. That's what you're saying, or that's how a lot of people take it. At the same time, while that's true in general, you might wonder whether or not that's true always. You might wonder whether or not that's true always. And you might wonder this too. Could there, again, be exceptions here? And what I have in mind here, this is David Hume. He's a very famous philosopher. He lived in the 1700s, and he defended a right to die. And what Hume said about this kind of argument, he said this. He says, I am not obliged to do a small good to society at the expense of a great harm to myself. And what Hume meant by this is just this. He's saying, look, fair enough. If I kill myself, it's going to harm everybody else around me. But at the same time, imagine someone like I was just describing who's suffering from unremitting, pain from cancer. All right, if I stay alive, I am being harmed. I'm suffering in absolute agony for all the rest of the days of my life. And what Hume is saying here is, even though by killing myself I cause pain and suffering for those around me, it's a greater kind of pain and suffering that would occur to myself to stay alive. And I'm not morally required, so says Hume, to spare a small pain to society at the expense of a great harm to myself. And so you can see here that what Hume is offering is really a kind of utilitarian type of argument. He's saying, well, look, we have to consider the intensities. Remember, we talked about this a long time ago. The intensities of the pains. Now, Hume came along long before utilitarianism was actually given that name, but he was a utilitarian, and he was a precursor to the utilitarian theory. And he's saying, look, if you look at the amount of pain a lot of people deal with at the late stages of cancer, look at that pain. Even though it's just one person, the intensity of the pain they're feeling outweighs all the harm that's done to others if they were to kill themselves. And this is actually something that's worth considering, because even though in general I think it would be ultimately selfish for a person to kill themselves, I'm open to hearing this kind of argument. I mean, there's something that I'm sympathetic to hearing here, because again, I've seen family members die from cancer, and it was just heart-wrenching to see them and the state of their life where they couldn't even sit in a chair without just being in absolute agony, because every part of their body that touched the chair, and I'm not talking about a wooden chair, I'm talking about a nice padded lazy boy, but every part of their body that touched it, it felt like someone was smacking them with a hammer. It hurt so bad. And what Hume is saying is, look, is it really right for them to suffer just so that I don't have to suffer this small amount? For them to suffer this great amount so that I don't have to suffer this small amount? And that's a pretty, interesting argument to make. And I'll leave it for you guys to decide. But hopefully what you can see here is we've been looking at the issue of the morality of suicide. And there are these arguments that come against suicide, and I think that those arguments are fairly strong. And the basic arguments are divided between arguments on the one hand that involve harms to yourself and sanctity of life, and then arguments on the other hand that involve harms to others. We've seen the responses to these as well, and you can you can make up your own mind as to which side you consider more plausible and more convincing. Now, apart from the morality of suicide, there's also an issue here about the rationality of suicide. And this is a different kind of issue altogether. These are often meshed together, but really and truly, there's a logical distinction that can be made here. Now, you might say, hey, I agree with people like David Hume. I think suicide is morally permissible in some cases. Heck, some people might say they think suicide is morally permissible in all cases. But we'll just push that issue of the morality of suicide to the side for right now. And they'll say this, look, even whether or not it's morally permissible or not, suicide is not rational. Even though it's not morally wrong per se, it is not rational. And what they're going to say here is, given that it's irrational, it's perfectly permissible for us to interfere and stop someone from committing suicide. You may have heard someone say something like this, like suicide is a long-term solution to a short-term problem. And this kind of argument that's being made here, this isn't really directed at whether or not suicide is morally right or morally wrong. It's basically saying that it's an irrational thing to do. It doesn't make sense. As the saying says here, it's a long-term solution to a short-term problem. There's no reason to kill yourself. Whatever problem you have can be fixed. It can be fixed. And suicide is really going overboard to try to fix whatever kind of problem you have. And this is an interesting kind of way of approaching it, because it does dispense with all these questions we might have about the morality of things, and it directs the conversation to the rationality. But in asking this, we're going to talk about whether or not suicide is in fact irrational, and we recognize that many things are rational and many things aren't rational. And sometimes things are perfectly rational and we let people get away with it. It's like, yeah, that's irrational. We don't care. Go right ahead and do it. But sometimes people do things that are irrational, and we're justified in stepping in and stopping them and restraining them, even sometimes using physical force to restrain them. And to stop people from doing harms to themselves, this is what is called a paternalistic intervention. Paternalistic, you can think of parent, it's like acting like a parent to a child. Sometimes we stop people from doing things because their actions would lead to harming other people. For instance, laws against murder. The reason we have a law against murder, we stop people from murdering, is because their actions harm others. But sometimes we stop people from doing things not because it necessarily harms others, but because they would be harming themselves. For instance, a seatbelt law, right? The reason a seatbelt law is in place is so you don't your head doesn't go through the glass window. You don't hurt yourself. It's not to stop you from hurting someone else. It's to stop you from hurting yourself. And that's why this is called a paternalistic law. And the question we're going to be looking at and exploring here is what exactly are the conditions under which paternalistic interventions are justified? And furthermore, is suicide something that falls under these conditions, or that meets these conditions? Are we allowed in stopping someone from harming themselves? If so, when? So this is a question we're going to be exploring here. There are a couple of different questions. Is suicide irrational? If it is irrational, is it the kind of irrationality that we have a right to stop? And what kinds of conditions are in place that would justify any sort of paternalistic intervention? So this is what we're going to be exploring. And the way we're going to go about addressing this is I want to ask you guys about different kinds of irrational actions and ask you if it's justifiable to stop someone from performing them. So I haven't really explained this very well, but we throw out the term rationality a whole lot. We'll say, well, that's rational or that's irrational. And as I was saying a second ago, there are different kinds of irrationality. And there are some things that people do that are just irrational. We're like, that's just stupid. But it's none of my business to say, stop them. But some things like, hey, that's just irrational, and I'm going to jump in and stop this person from doing it. All right? We kind of looked at some examples of this a long time ago, in a way, when I was talking about, covering yourself in tattoos from head to toe. And I said, to me, that's irrational because it's going to interfere with any kind of job opportunities you might have. But if you want to do it, it's none of my business to tell you no. But what I want to do here is kind of tease out the different kinds of irrationality that exist. And so I'm going to give you some examples and just kind of lay it out there. Typically I do this in a class and we have responses. I'll ask the questions and students will give me responses. Unfortunately, we can't do that in an online class. But I'm going to just lay these out and tell you what the typical responses are of students when I ask them. So let's imagine there's a 32-year-old man who wants to play the lottery. Well, the first question we might ask here is such an action irrational? And the answer to this is yes, it's actually very irrational. Now, I know a lot of you play the lottery, and I'm not criticizing any of you who do, but it actually is irrational. Why is that? Well, because the way that the games are structured, in the long run, you're guaranteed to lose. Now, I know some people make money playing the lottery, but the reality is just statistically, you're guaranteed to lose. And I could explain to you exactly why that is, but if nothing else, I will give you the explanation, but before I give you that explanation, just know this, is that states take in way more money than they ever pay out. And since states make every year, the state of Virginia makes billions of dollars off the lottery, what that tells you is they're taking in way more than they're paying out. This actually, the lottery, I think it was first done by the mob. This is what someone told me, and that it was busted by the feds. It's like, you can't do this. This is a numbers racket. This is, just illegal. But now the states all do it, but they call it the lottery, and I guess it's okay. But here's why it's mathematically silly to play the lottery. If you ever look on like a scratcher ticket, like a $1 scratcher ticket, on the back it'll tell you you have a 1 in 5 chance of winning a break-even prize. And what that means is for every $5 you pay, you'll win $1 back. Now think about that for a second. If you play like that, in the long run, you're going to go broke. For every $5 you pay, you'll win $1 back. Well, the structure of every other single ticket is the exact same way. If you're winning $250, that probably means you had to pay $1,000 to win $250 back. Now, I know sometimes you might get lucky and win the $250 up front, but what I'm saying is the structure of the game itself. If you keep buying, if you buy 1,000 tickets, or you buy $1,000 worth of tickets, you'll get $250 back. It's going to be structured every single game in that exact same way. So this is why the lottery is just irrational to do. However, if you're an adult and you want to play the lottery, I'm not going to stop you. It is an irrational decision by my estimation, but you're an adult and you're perfectly fine to do it. And typically students, they agree with me on this. They'll say, okay, yeah, I see something mathematically, it doesn't make sense, but if you want to do it, fair enough. So what if there's a 32-year-old man who gambles away his life savings? There was actually a case of this. A British man liquidated everything he owned. I think his life savings, he was in his mid-30s or so, it came to like $150,000, and he went to Vegas and put it all on one spin of the roulette wheel. That's stupid in my opinion. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. That's just insane. The thing about it is he won. He actually won on one spin of the roulette wheel. I guess you can bet, red or black, and he just did that. It's absolutely insane. He didn't even own the clothes on his back. He had rented a tuxedo, so he didn't own anything. It's absolutely crazy. But if he is competent and rational, I don't have a right to interfere. I just don't have a right to interfere at all here. Here's another example. Suppose that there's, I think I wrote this when I was 32 years old. That's why you keep seeing a 32-year-old man, because I just assumed that was an adult who was competent. But suppose there's a 32-year-old man who eats unhealthy food and doesn't exercise. Let's say he eats 3 Five Guys hamburgers every day for lunch. He eats 2 Domino's pizzas, every night. He never exercises. Well, there's something really irrational about that, because you're putting yourself at greater risk for basically every kind of medical condition there is. But I have no right to come in your house and restrain you. I have no right to slap the cheeseburger out of your mouth. I just don't have that right. And I think most people would agree. Now I could talk to you and say, hey, Bob, you shouldn't be eating this way. It's really unhealthy. I could say that, but I don't have a right to stop him, to use any kind of paternalistic restraint. There's a difference here between, offering someone advice and actually using restraint. And I don't have that right. And most people agree when it comes to something like this. I'll just do a couple more examples. Suppose there's a 32-year-old who, let's say they're single, no children, and they smoke 12 packs a day in the privacy of their own home. Now again, extremely irrational. You're killing yourself slowly here. But I don't have a right to knock the cigarette out of your mouth. I can tell you about the dangers of cigarette smoke, but I don't have a right to restrain you or coerce your actions in any kind of way. What about this one? How about, suppose there's a 32-year-old who enjoys riding a motorcycle without a helmet. Yet again, something extremely irrational to do. In fact, I've been told by people who work in the ER that people who ride motorcycles without helmets, they're often referred to as organ donors, because once your head hits the concrete or asphalt at 65 miles an hour, it busts open like a watermelon. It is a completely stupid thing to do. But if you're in a state where it's legal, like Florida, and I could tell you, hey, if you hit your head on the ground, you're going to die. And if you say, well, look, I'm an adult, I don't give a shit, I don't shoot, I don't care, then you're within your right to go ahead and do that. That is your prerogative. So I look at all these examples I've given you, and hopefully you can see here that each one of these there's something irrational here. But in none of these cases are we within our rights to interfere with the action. Like I said, we can offer information, we can offer persuasion, but we can't coerce the person in any kind of way. Now, having looked at all of these, I'm going to give you a couple more, and these might be a little different. Suppose there's a 7-year-old child who wants to stick their hand in a hot fire, like they're just looking at a hot fire, and they go to reach their hand into that hot fire. Do you think you'd be within your rights? Do you think it'd be justifiable to grab them and stop them and restrain them? Even if they persisted, even if they fought you, would you be within your rights to constrain them? And everybody I've ever asked has said yes. I think one person said no, but I think they were just being silly. But yeah, it seems like you're perfectly within your rights. And the 7-year-old child sticking your hand in a hot fire, that's irrational. And this is different from, number 6 is different from 1 through 5. The rationality or irrationality represented here does allow for a kind of justifiable interference, does allow for a paternalistic restraint. What about this one? Suppose there's a 32-year-old man who desires to jump off of a 20-story building because he believes he'll float away. Do you think in that case, would you be like, well, sometimes you got to jump? Or do you think you'd say, no, I'm going to stop you, even if this required, shoving him to the ground, restraining him? Assuming that you don't get hurt or get thrown off the building in the process, do you think you'd be within your rights to restrain them? And yet again here, it seems like, yeah, you would. You'd be allowed to step in and restrain the person. One final example. Suppose a friend is drunk and they want to drive home. Do you think you'd be allowed, do you think it would be justifiable to restrain them? And here again, yes. I think most all of us agree that you would be within your rights, in fact, obligated to restrain them. Now notice here, there's something very different about 1 through 5 and 6, 7, and 8. Everything on this list, everything, 1 through 8, the person is trying to perform an action that is irrational. And the question we have to ask is, well, why is it with 1 through 5, we didn't seem justified in interfering with their action, but 6, 7, and 8, we seem justified, and in fact we seem compelled. We seem like we're required to interfere with what's going on. And there are a couple of different things here that I think are at work that would justify us interfering. One thing is that with everything, 6, 7, and 8, the action the person is trying to do is something that would cause them great harm. Now, you look at the 7-year-old who wants to put their hand in a hot fire. What if the 7-year-old was trying to do something else that wouldn't cause them great harm? What if they kept leaving their bicycle outside at night? And you told them, all right, don't do that, it's going to get stolen. And after about the 5th time, you bring it in the house. And after about the 6th or 7th time of you bringing it in the house and telling them that, you're like, you know what, I'm going to leave the bicycle outside. And then the bicycle gets stolen. Now, that's something, the child would be upset, but they would learn a valuable lesson. They wouldn't be scarred for the rest of their life. So you might allow a small harm to come to them because it has a payoff in the end. It teaches them a valuable lesson. But sticking your hand in a hot fire, they're going to be permanently scarred for the rest of their life. It could do all kinds of considerable damage to them and cause them extreme pain. Again, like someone, maybe your friend is drunk. They don't want to drive home. They just want to take their shirt off and pretend like they're Chicken Man. Or maybe they want to roll themselves up. I had a friend who did this once at a party. He rolled himself up in a rug by the door and claimed he was a human taco. Okay, that's really strange. He's not harming anybody. He was really happy. I'm not going to interfere. So we'll sometimes allow people to do things that are silly and crazy like that, but they're not going to harm anyone else. They're not going to harm themselves. Or if the harm that is caused to them, like with the child who gets their bicycle stolen, is a moderate harm and it has a payoff in the end, we'll allow that. But in each one of these cases, 6, 7, and 8, there's a serious threat that's going to potentially come to them. Not only that, there's a big difference here between the examples listed in 1 through 5 and the examples listed in 6, 7, and 8 in terms of the cognitive ability of the person in question. In 1 through 5, everyone was competent. It's just they were misusing their rationality. Whereas in 6, 7, and 8, the person in question, or the person is questionable whether or not they're rational at all. They have even the cognitive ability to make a well-informed decision. Certainly, if someone is drunk, like they're really drunk, they lack the cognitive ability to make a well-informed decision. And number 7, if someone thinks they're actually going to fly away, unless they're Superman, they're just delusional, right? They're not rational. And a 7-year-old, even though they have some capabilities, they're not fully developed yet, where they could understand perfectly well the consequences of their actions. And so in 6, 7, and 8. What we see here is not just the misuse of their rationality, but the absence of rationality altogether. And so what we can do is we can summarize the common feature of 6, 7, and 8 and the conditions under which paternalistic intervention would be justified. And we can summarize them just like this. Is number 1, the action being prevented is for the individual's own good, and if allowed would cause serious harm. Number 2, the individual lacks the ability to make a rational, well-informed decision. And then finally we could add, the action being prevented is not the one the individual would choose if they possessed the ability to make a rational, well-informed decision. And so these are the conditions under which we are justified in stopping someone from doing something, not because the action is immoral, but because the action is irrational. And the question we have to ask at this point is, does suicide meet the conditions spelled out here? If someone is contemplating suicide, are we justified in interfering because the action in question is so irrational that it would warrant a paternalistic intervention on our part? Now, clearly it meets number 1. The action being prevented, if allowed, would cause serious harm to the individual. If someone is killing themselves, that's a serious harm, I think, by any definition of the term. Number 2, the individual lacks the ability to make a rational, well-informed decision. This is where things get really tricky when it comes to suicide. And what we typically think is that if somebody is depressed, in that state of depression, they lack the ability to make a well-informed decision. People who are depressed are typically not deemed to be competent. They're not within their full way of thinking. And if they weren't depressed, they would make different kinds of decisions for themselves. And what some people argue is that if you are contemplating suicide, then by definition, you are depressed. If you're contemplating suicide, then you've deemed your entire existence to not be worth anything, and so therefore you're not thinking straight, and you're not able to make a well-informed decision. And if you weren't depressed, this action that you're contemplating, you would never choose. It's only for this condition that you're choosing to make this decision. And so what some people argue is that, yes, suicide justifies, apart from the morality of it, it justifies interference on our part because the person is trying to commit an action that would cause serious harm. And in that state, that particular state where they're contemplating suicide, they lack the ability to make a rational, well-informed decision. By definition, they're suicidal. That means they're not thinking straight. They're depressed. And so we have a moral duty to stop them from performing the action in question.